So model context protocol seems to be all the rage these days, but you probably don't need it. And in this video, I'll show you what it is, how it fits into the overall LLM stack, and then we'll build one from scratch and combine it with a few existing MCPs. Now, what it is basically a sort of universal language established so that people can create self-contained pieces of logic that are easily accessible by other LLM applications. And this is in the form of tools and resources. Most AI models have a functionality called tool calling, where you will give it a description of a tool that you're providing and a name, and then it'll figure out based on a user's message whether it should use that tool. So if we did something like, here's a tool called weather, get weather, and the description would be something like, fetches the weather given an area code. If a user asks for the weather in area code 65513, it's going to actually say, use tool get weather. And what you'd have in your code base is a get weather function somewhere that calls an API. Now, what model context protocol does is it formalizes a way to actually build these self-contained pieces of functionality, like, for example, this weather get weather tool, and then just expose those as individual applications that run on their own. And so that's what an MCP server is. It is an application that's running on its own and that exposes a bunch of tools or resources. And so when clients connect to it, they can automatically see what are the capabilities this server is offering. So instead of having all sorts of integrations custom built into every single LLM app you can have individual MCP servers running wherever and just connect to those directly. So a basic architecture of the model context protocol here is that we have a host and a client that connects to an MCP server. So the host, for example, here would be Cursor or Claude Desktop. And what it would do is, once you define an MCP server inside Cursor, it would actually then launch a client, MCP client, that connects to your MCP server. Now, in this video, I'm just going to focus on how we would define an MCP server and configure it and run it. So on the face of it, tools on an MCP server are just basically functions. And these functions can be any sort of custom logic that you put into it. They can call it external APIs, local APIs, databases, fetch local files, access restricted resources. And all they expose is the tool name and the expected schema. So for example, if we have a tool that fetches documentation from some remote server for a given code, if we connect this now to our Cursor client, what's going to happen is that once we make some queries to Cursor's chat window, Cursor's AI will then figure out when it needs to use that tool. If we're asking for documentation, for example, it'll say, oh, we can use this tool, and then you would actually accept, and then that actually gets called to our MCP server, which executes the tool call. Similarly for resources. Resources you can just think of as sort of like attachments that you would drag and drop into ChatGPT window, whether it's text documents or PDFs. So you can similarly expose resources through your MCP server so that you can maybe protect access, protect certain resources, and not have that kind of code mixed in with your core application code. So let's see what one of these actually looks like. Let's code one up. We just use the Model Context Protocol SDK. Makes things very simple. What you could do is you either define resources prompts or tools on your initialized server object. In this case, I'm just returning some static text for a resource just for demonstration purposes. But in here, in this callback, is where you would actually do any sort of fetching for local files. And then here, what I've set up is like a replicate API endpoint that generates an image. So in this case, I have a replicate tool, which is image generation basically for the replicate API. And what we've done here is we've taken in the server and we're going to just register a tool. So this is our name for the tool. Let's say create YouTube thumbnail. And this is our description. So these are the items or sort of the information the LLM is going to get when it pings our MCP server to see what do we offer, what are the services and capabilities that our server offers. And then the callback that runs when this tool is actually initialized. So we basically just call an API. We output the image to our local directory here, and then we return just the URL. This is because I'm testing it in Claude Desktop. I didn't look at how to actually render it within Claude. I'm sure you could do it. Now, one other thing is that there are two main methods of transport that you have to define on your server. It's either a standard I/O server transport or an HTTP. So we use standard I/O if your server is going to run on your local machine as well as your application. So if you're not transferring data outside of your local network, then you would use a standard I/O server. Otherwise, if your MCP server is going to run somewhere in the cloud, or it's going to be accessed by LLM applications somewhere across the internet, then you would use an HTTP server transport. So the final thing you would need to do is just set up a build script where we'll actually have the output JS file, and that's basically just a simple TypeScript build. And we also want to actually chmod it so that it can be executed by other applications. And then we have to actually give the MCP client that we're using the location of our user. Now, if you go to Claude Desktop under settings, if you go to developer and you hit edit config, you have this file. And under this file, as you can tell, is where you would define all your servers. So here I've called it content pipeline. And what you would do is you would put your build output location on the args. And so when you do launch Claude Desktop, you would notice you have these tools here. And if your server is here, that means it has launched correctly. I think it is create YouTube thumbnail. So this is the tool that's available because it's been loaded from our content pipeline server, as you can see here. Now I've added a bunch of others I want to show you in a little bit. As we've seen here, there's also the file system and everything. And so what you could do is if you go in here and say, generate an image, let's see if it's going to do it. You see it's asking me to run this tool. Now, what if you want to actually use this in Claude, or sorry, in Cursor? Well, if you go to Cursor and if you go to Cursor settings, you can go down to MCP, you can see here any server MCP servers that have been enabled. And the way you add them is by adding an mcp.json in your .cursor directory in your root folder of your project. So you can sort of do the same thing, but just do it in this .cursor directory. You can define them here. But one thing to note is that you actually have to enable them once you add them. So they won't be enabled by default. You have to click enable. Here it's disabled. And then once you talk to your agent here, you can say something like, I don't know, create a file in my downloads test.txt. Let's see if it's going to do it. If it's going to figure out to use the file system. Yeah, MCP tool, right? So these are just ones that I've actually added from the internet. There's a whole server files list at this Model Context Provider server file system repository you can find online. And that's the basic gist of Model Context Protocol. Let me know in the comments if you made your own MCP service. Throw a link down there or any comments you may have. Cheers.